Welcome everybody to this panel on reversing the global tide of inequality. Obviously always a huge topic for Davos and particularly important this year as the economic slowdown and the cost of living crises that have hit the world with high food and energy costs has disproportionately hit the poorer members of society. So we have a great panel to discuss this key topic. I'll just quickly introduce them. José Antonio Ocampo, Minister of Finance and Public Credit of Colombia. Gabriela Bucher, Executive Director of Oxfam International. Joaquin Castro, Congressman from Texas in the United States. And Allison Schrager, Senior Fellow of the Manhattan Institute for Policy Research. So please welcome our excellent panel. Thank you. So we have 45 minutes, and we're going to dig into some of these issues, but I'm going to leave some time for questions at the end, so please do have a think about what you want to ask the panel as we go along. I'm going to start with you, Gabriela. The World Bank recently published a report showing that after many decades of declining inequality on a global basis, it's actually begun to tick up again in the last few years since the pandemic. You've actually published a report yourself around this gap. Is this a beginning of a new trend in the opposite direction, or is this a short-term phenomenon?
Well, thanks for the question. Very happy to be here. So, yes, Oxfam publishes a report every year to coincide with the Davos and the WEF forum, and we focus on inequality and, of course, all the negative consequences of inequality and options to address it. And this time what we see is really an explosion of inequality that has come with the pandemic time and all the different elements that you mentioned, the cost of living crisis, but beyond that there is really a hunger crisis in the world. 1 in 10 people in the world is facing hunger. We have a debt crisis in the world as well, which is really reducing the ability of most low-income, middle-income countries to invest in their citizens. And also the pandemic really hit this very unequal world already, and it showed the fractures that it already had. It exposed them and magnified them. So to answer your question, I'm not, the way we see it, the way we see what has happened is this moment of shock exposed the inequalities and increased them, and it would require us to really have a moment of reflection of how we reverse this trend. It needs active policy making and determination, and to question some of the assumptions that took us here. So maybe I'll stop there, but it's really understanding that the system that we have been under for many years has really been a system that privileges a few more wealthy individuals. So we speak about the 1%, 80 million out of the 8 billion that live in the world, who in any circumstance, in the good times and the bad times, tend to do well. So rain or shine, the billionaires tend to do well. And that was shown in the pandemic time because actually there's been an accumulation, an acceleration of that accumulation. So now the wealthiest 1% is taking to double what 99% of humanity is taking in terms of new wealth created. So that's really an astonishing amount. And it's, of course, in contrast to before it was half. So 1% was taking half of new wealth in comparison to 99% taking the other half, which was already extreme. So now we're at new levels of extreme inequality.
Let's start with the system, and then we'll go on to solutions separately. But so, José Antonio, the system at the moment, and how much of this explosion of inequality that Gabriela's talking about has been about government response to the pandemic and other things, and how much of it is deglobalization and some of these trends that help to alleviate poverty, and how much of it is just a one-off shock? Can you give your perspective on that?
Perhaps let me differentiate two different issues.
Yes.
Because there is, let's say, the inequality, let's say, between countries or among countries, and inequalities within countries. Because the phenomenon of inequality within countries has probably more widespread than inequality between countries, basically because inequality between countries, let's say the rise of China and India, for example, weigh heavily. You ask me, Latin America has fallen behind anyway. So it's inequality of Latin America vis-a-vis the rest of the world is increasing for a long time, for decades now. Anyway, so I think that's very important. Now, in the case, I think the inequality between countries may be, in the case, I mean, related to the question of globalization, maybe reduced partly by globalization because of the opportunities. For example, the rise of China was very much associated to its participation in the global system through exporting, different goods, etc. Which, now of course China is changing the direction of domestic market, let's say. But for a long time it was. Now it's of course globalizing itself in a different way. For example, investment, let's say. Now, India also has had opportunities, although less so integrated into the global market. So that's one point. But for other parts of the world, integrating into global markets has not been a very successful story. I think, let's say, except for brief periods, Africa or Latin America have not been doing very well in the global system, let's say. So you can say globalization gives opportunities, but very unequal opportunities. Okay. Now, domestically, it's a broader phenomenon. I think even many advanced countries, I mean, not only the United States, have experienced increasing inequality within. Right. So that's a more widespread phenomenon. So it has been, I think, quite well documented.
Joaquin, I mean, in your view, just talking about the system at the moment. I mean, is the system broken if it's allowing such concentration at the top and such challenge at the bottom? I mean, what's your perspective on that?
I would say yes, it is. Well, let me start at the end with what we wish for people, okay, and what has been built in certain countries and what unfortunately doesn't exist in all countries. The United States over the years has been, I think, as an American, I'm going to argue, the country that's been most successful in building an infrastructure of opportunity for its people. So if you think about it, just as there's an infrastructure of roads and streets and highways that helps people get to where they want to go on the road, in certain countries, there is an infrastructure of opportunity that helps people get to where they want to go in life. That includes economic prosperity. So if somebody wants to grow up and be an engineer, they are able to go to school, go to university, get the credentials, and be an engineer. That infrastructure of opportunity does not exist in many countries. And so the gap over the years between rich countries, and I'm using a binary description here, rich countries and poor countries, has just grown. It's also grown within nations. I represent a very working class, mostly Mexican-American district in San Antonio, and many of those folks have been forgotten by the system as we describe it. And so yes, I do think it's broken. And I think it needs a reevaluation, and not just a reevaluation, but it needs policymakers to go in and make strong adjustments to fix it.
So let's go into that more in a second, but just on the sort of top level perspective, one of the things that is talked about here a lot is globalization and how it's lifted people out of poverty around the world over many years. What's your perspective from where you sit in your constituency in the States about whether, at this time when, there is a more zero-sum approach to the world where, geopolitics and other things have begun to throw spanners into that, is a rebooting of globalization a good thing for your constituents, or is that a bad thing when it comes to this?
I come from Texas. I represent the main San Antonio district. And Texas does more trade than any state in the nation. In fact, NAFTA was agreed upon in my hometown of San Antonio in the 1990s. And so undoubtedly, there have been many benefits to trade. But there also have been many people that have been left behind. And that's why in the United States, you saw a strong debate over TPP, a strong debate over USMCA, the rewriting of NAFTA. So to answer your question, yes, it can be good if trade agreements have strong labor provisions, have strong environmental provisions, and really are rebooted in the contemporary era. I don't think we're going to go back to trade agreements from the 1970s or the 1980s. It's got to take into account the world today.
Allison, just to bring you in at this point, I mean, what is your perspective of the role of trade and of globalization in helping to solve these problems?
I think it's really critical. I mean, I look at this sort of inequality that's getting worse today. And I mean, to be honest, I don't think inequality in of itself is a bad thing. I think it's a symptom of some very wrong things that we need to work on. I think, people live in intolerable poverty. I think prosperity is not always felt by everyone. And I think experiencing increasing prosperity is really important. And I think sometimes the inequality is a symptom of those things not happening. But inequality in of itself isn't necessarily terrible if everyone's experiencing improvements in their living standards and Jeff Bezos gets crazy rich. I mean, that's not the worst thing. And I think what we saw, I mean, as you pointed out, China and India experienced it more, but we did see countries across the world, when we did more trade, when we did more liberalization, did really experience some increase in prosperity. Not as much as we would like, and there's certainly reforms we can do to sort of make that process more even and less perilous. But it concerns me a lot that I think we are moving into more of a zero-sum world where growth is not created, because a lot of what made sort of narrowed the gaps was economic growth, and I think that should really be our priority.
José Antonio, do you want to just comment on what mistakes governments made sort of in the pandemic and since then that has allowed this gulf to open up? I mean, are there things that should have been done differently that we can learn from here?
I don't think the management of the pandemic was the problem.
Not the pandemic, but since the pandemic, but yeah, okay.
No, because the pandemic, more or less, everyone increases spending to support those who have left, had no jobs or have no opportunities. So I actually think the pandemic, I mean, very peculiar, one of the effects of that is high debts, which is a major problem today.
Sure.
In most countries of the world, actually. Anyway, but I don't think there is anything specific in the recent period that will underscore. I mean, perhaps what is dramatic, of course, since last year was the invasion of Ukraine, because that generated a massive increase in food prices, which have affected the world, and there's a food scarcity problem now in many parts of the world, and I think that has affected negatively the poor. But and of course it has generated a problem in some African countries, for example, in terms of food scarcity. Even in my own country, there's a serious problem of very high food prices. So that's a particular phenomenon. Of course, energy prices also, but that's I think probably a different phenomenon. But I don't think that's not in a sense an economic effect. It's an effect of
Sure.
Of a military operation. Yeah.
Sorry, Gabriela.
Yeah, so I agree that shock of the conflict has been an element, but in Oxfam we have analyzed that the access to vaccine or not was a key determinant in how much impact the pandemic had in terms of economic shocks and the length of recovery. So, and precisely the vaccine hoarding that happened, right, and the very profit-driven model that was accepted by all, which we, with many others, campaigned against, because we said, it should be a people's vaccine, in a pandemic moment especially, people should be at the center, but in general. So how do we ensure that public goods, a vaccine should be a public good, and should be available in such a moment, not only because it's the right and the right to life, but also because in reality it has had these ripple effects that have affected those least developed countries, but in reality it has affected everyone. But just to finish briefly, also health systems, were exposed. So you don't only need the vaccine, you need to be able to distribute, you need to have all the infrastructure, so that wasn't present in so many countries, and that was also a big change. A big gap, and that the next thing that happened is because of this debt crisis, then we have, on average, low-income countries are spending $1 in health for every 4 on debt repayments. So this is why all these things are compounding each other, and the trajectory doesn't look good unless there's intervention.
Joaquin, can I bring you in here? So when times were good, there was a lot more largesse from richer countries to help and to be willing to help other countries progress and share the wealth, as it were. When it got tougher to this point about vaccine hoarding, it's been much more about dealing with domestic challenges. There's less money around. Is that just kind of a reality that's going to get worse going forward, given the geopolitical situation and other things? Or are there, how do you see that bigger question?
I'm caught in your question between wanting to give a realistic answer and giving an idealistic answer.
Let's do both. Give me the realistic.
I mean, realistically, yes, domestic politics often control how a member of Congress or a member of Parliament votes on giving away other things, so to speak, to countries. That's a reality. But the fates of wealthy nations and poor nations, as we all know, are very well intertwined. And let me give you a quick example, a very pertinent example of that in the United States and in Europe. In the United States, we're dealing with a mass migration issue right now of people from different parts of the world, but particularly over the last many years from Central America, the Northern Triangle countries, coming up to the Texas-Mexico border. And these are countries that have been beset by economic deprivation, by drug gangs who are threatening folks, by a very weak rule of law. Capital is either going to move towards people or people are going to move towards capital. That's what we see around the world. So capital is going to help make it so that people have economic opportunity. Capital is going to help make it so that the rule of law is stronger. Capital is going to make it so that you can combat climate change and people won't have to flee because they're climate refugees. So when we talk about income inequality, the way that I'm thinking about it is how are we going to accomplish growth for nations, but also accomplish it in a way that is capacity building for the people in those countries, not just for American corporations or European corporations to come in there and end up paying people a few dollars an hour for their labor, and then their standard, unarguably, is not at zero anymore. It is a little bit better, but is that really what we wish for people and what we wish for the world? I would argue no. And I would argue that the people at this conference and the companies at this conference, if they put their minds together and their wills together, have the ability to really change things. And it's the responsibility of people to change things because people are suffering.
And you mentioned global warming. Obviously, this is one of those areas which accentuates this challenge, but also is a place where that shared endeavor is required. I mean, do you see any sense of that catalyzing the type of thinking that you're espousing here?
I've been very impressed and surprised, actually, by how climate change has really been threaded through a lot of the discussions here and how people seem to be on the same page about it now. That was not the case, I would say, even a dozen years ago. But it shows you the power and the ability of a group of folks with a lot of influence to come together and make real change in the world and put the world on a much better trajectory on this issue and the issue of global warming and climate change. But it's going to have to be like that, on not just on one issue, but on many different issues.
I'm going to come to you in 1 second, but just, Allison, who's driving this at the moment? I mean, sort of globalization, being sort of trying to share the wealth more, it's not a popular thing domestically in most countries nowadays. Can you give your sense of, who is driving that sort of agenda right now?
Globalization?
Well, globalization and the willingness to sort of see the bigger picture when it comes to creating prosperity and deploying capital and other things in other countries.
Yeah, I mean, something I think a bad outlook for me for inequality is the fact that more and more people are seeing wealth and growth as zero sum. That, if we're growing here, they can't be growing here. And I think that's sort of turning to a lot more, as I said, policies that, are discouraging trade, reshoring, and, less immigration. I mean, I think globalization and more immigration, are the easiest ways to sort of lift everyone up. So, I mean, I think a lot of it is being driven by popular pressure and, I mean, honestly, stalled growth. I mean, as I said, rising living standards keeps people happy. And what I think we're seeing a lot in certainly a lot of developing countries is growth had been stalling even before the pandemic, and that was leading to a lot of discontent. And that's when I think people start looking inward and feel like they can't afford to give to others, when really, I mean, I think the real miracle of the last 20 years was briefly this, that we all agreed for the first time that, global growth is something that's shared. This isn't zero sum. We can all benefit, and that we can grow the pie.
And how much of that, I'll come to you, Gabriela, is about the fact that, and some people have mentioned this already, there is a lot of debt out there. There's not as much money to spend. And by the way, the cost of that has obviously rocketed in the last year or two as well.
Yeah, but the only way we're going to pay for that debt is improvements in productivity and growth. Because, I mean, when you look at our debt scenarios, at least in America, they look pretty dire. And I'm really concerned about rising interest rates that we're getting out of a zero rate regime. And, you know, with, especially with pensions and things like that coming, money's going to be tight. And really, if you look at all the sort of debt scenarios, the only optimistic scenarios is that we grow more. And so I think growth is our only sort of hope. Right. And unfortunately, that takes, you know, risk and capital and sort of tolerating.
And cooperation.
Yeah. Exactly.
Gabriela, you've been putting your hand up. So
yeah, so I think, you know, I wouldn't agree that the only hope for addressing the debt problem is growth. And of course, there's a debt issue in the US, but there's a debt issue globally. And what is, at the moment, what is happening in most countries is austerity measures to balance the books. And austerity measures means cutting down on health, on education, on all those basic things. And so I agree that, you know, prosperity is desirable. The point is, how do we measure it? What is prosperity? Is it about GDP or, you know, GDP per capita, or is it about people's lives? And you know, for example, in Sao Paulo, a few blocks away from each other, one person can have a 22-year life expectancy above someone else. So that's the type of difference that inequality causes in people's lives. So our opportunity to live longer, healthier, educated, to be able to benefit from those, from wealth creation. But then also, I wanted to come back on the issue of climate, because the climate crisis and inequality are completely intertwined. So they're not two issues, and they're system issues together. So in order to address the climate crisis, which is also created by industrialization, you know, all these years of prosperity, growth, which has been primarily benefiting, let's say, the global North, North America, Europe, which, you know, has depleted much of what we call the global South. And in fact, those impacts of the climate crisis are primarily affecting countries in the global South. So it's not only that there was a carbon budget that we know we're running out of, and it was taken primarily in that process of growth. So is growth on its own going to help us out? I wonder. I think we need to think about how we change consumption also. We have measured as Oxfam how much the average person in the 1% consumes to a level that is 30 times above what is compatible with 1.5 degree warming. The rest of humanity, we have whole countries, Somalia on 0.01% contribution to the carbon problem, and they have devastating effects with the droughts right now. So that inequality is deep, and it's deeply systemic. So, and it requires all of us to rethink, you know, our role, each of our roles, but also look at policies. And that's why concretely we say policies around taxation are critical, because tax is a concrete way in which one translates a social contract. And it depends by country. Each country has to have a conversation about it, but it means what do we value, and do we value people's lives? And at the moment, the tax burden has shifted from those who have most to the average person. So VAT is a very regressive tax, and it really affects people now in the cost of living crisis. It doesn't affect an average.
Let's get on to that, because I know you've got strong opinions on that, and we'll have a debate about that. But just on the bigger picture of, you know, you mentioned that the impact of global warming falls disproportionately on the global South, and that a lot of the benefits of industrialization came to the richer countries. Joaquin, how do you think about this concept of loss and damage around climate and the responsibility of richer countries who have benefited in the past to help those most affected both transition their energy but also react to some of the big climate challenges and the extreme weather events that cause chaos?
I think that wealthier nations should take a great responsibility in being helpful and quite honestly need to do more. And not only in terms of financial investment and commitment and aid and assistance, development assistance, but also in terms of public policy. You know, I have argued and others have argued that the United States should consider climate refugees and others around, other nations around the world should consider climate refugees. So I think it's all of those things.
Gabriela, will you just outline, you put out your report, and I'm sure many people in this room have read it, that outlined the level of inequality and your response, which is for very significant redistribution of wealth through wealth taxes and other things. Can you just, well, if I'm misquoting you, please correct me, but if you just quickly lay out your view, and then I'd love to go to Jose Antonio, who's done this in his country, and see how it works in practice.
I'll say it briefly because I think we can talk about this for a long time, but it's not significant redistribution. It's the fact that most countries don't have net wealth tax and don't have, or have capital gains actually at much lower rates than income tax rates. Half of billionaires live in countries with no inheritance tax. So there's a lot to be done in terms of the element of wealth taxation, in terms of complementing the tax mix. So in this report, we talk about that. We've talked about corporate taxation in others, but it's about rebalancing because it's really falling too much on the average person. So we said some small percentages, because when net wealth are small percentages from wealthy, the ultra rich, so multimillionaires, billionaires, and we calculated that in the report. You see, up to 5%, which goes for that progressive wealth taxation, because we apply that concept also for income taxation, would raise 1.7 trillion annually, and that actually ends world poverty and can deliver a 10-year plan to end hunger and can invest on health and education in the poorest countries, and also addresses some funds for loss and damage. So that's the amount that is actually currently concentrated in very few hands. You know, billionaires is the same amount of participants at Davos this year. That's the amount of people.
Okay, so that's an ambitious plan. Jose Antonio, you have got a wealth tax in Colombia. How does it work in practice?
Well, let me say that there are two different issues, again, national and global, which are different but complementary. In the case of let's say, national taxes, the issue of progressive income taxes, of course, an element which is relatively common. What is not is wealth taxes. And a basic reason for wealth taxes is, of course, that some of the, let's say, the capital income is significantly underestimated for personal income taxes. So one of the arguments in favor of wealth taxes is that there is a way of let's say, of taxing things that were not taxed. For example, capital gains, taxes which are very low everywhere. Even inheritance taxes, for example, is another factor. You can mention many more. That's for natural. That's why in Colombia, historically we have had wealth taxes in the tax reform that we passed last year under my leadership in Colombia. We put a wealth tax which goes up to 1.5%, of the wealth. Now, internationally, there is another problem, which was the subject of the OECD negotiations on the so-called OECD inclusive framework 2 years ago. And I think there are two basic problems. The first one is tax competition, giving benefits to firms or to investors, let's say, to bring them to invest in your country, which of course erodes the tax base of the other countries and your own tax base because you're reducing the taxes. So it's globally it's a reduction of the.
People are mobile.
Yeah.
People can.
Yeah. That's one point. That's in the decision that was taken. There was a 15% minimum tax, which is lower than many of us argue should have been adopted. But the other is the taxation of multinationals. The fact that they don't pay fairly in all the places where they sell or produce. In some cases, there is absolutely no taxes. For example, all the digital services basically pay no taxes where the people consume. They say so that's why there's disagreement that there has to be a new way of taxing multinationals in such a way that every place where they operate gives the fair share of the taxes paid by that multinational rather than the headquarters. In our view, the view of developing countries, the agreement that was reached 2 years ago in OECD is very favorable to developed countries because the headquarters of the multinationals are benefiting. That's why in other places, let me say just two initiatives in the G20 under India now. They had the meeting of finance ministers, of course, virtual. I participated virtual at 3 a.m. Colombian time. But it was very interesting because I put India now should lead a reform of that in order to have more benefits for developing countries. And we're taking, with support of the ECLAC, the Economic Commission for Latin America, and Open Society, an initiative to do a Latin American agreement on tax cooperation in order to see how we can also manage regionally some of these taxation problems.
Allison, obviously mathematically wealth taxes reduce inequality. Are they a good idea?
No. So there's a lot of reasons. And first of all, as I said, I think our best way to sort of deliver prosperity, and honestly sustainable prosperity, is through growth, through innovation. Because innovation allows us to use resources more efficiently and sort of include everyone in the global economic system. And the problem with wealth taxes, and particularly unrealized capital gains taxes, is it pretty much reduces the return on investment, particularly 5%, which is significant. I said, like, these percentages sound small, but when you assess them on a stock of wealth year after year, effectively you're taking away the return on investment, which sort of undermines growth. Now, that aside, I think wealth taxes are it's a non-starter because they are impossible to implement. It's very difficult. I mean, I guess Switzerland has the most successful wealth tax. It's pretty small. It accounts for 3% of their tax revenue because it is really hard to measure wealth. Like, really hard. Like, when you get your paycheck, you know what that is. You know, you get a pay stub, the government knows what that is, you can tax that. But especially very wealthy people hold a lot of their assets in like private equity, businesses, family heirlooms, all these things. And it is really hard to assess it. I mean, this is why Europe keeps trying to do wealth taxes and ends up giving up. And I think the incentives involved get kind of toxic because if you're going to have to pay tax on a publicly traded asset, you have more of an incentive to keep your businesses private, to invest in private equity. And that means the best companies end up not being available. I think one of the great things that's happened in America recently is that we have more participation in the stock market, which means it gives the opportunity for a lot of people to invest in our most valuable companies. That goes away. Or sort of when I was in grad school, I studied public finance, and one of my favorite professors who does tax policy said the thing about wealth taxes is it makes, first of all, you know, it's a fairly blunt instrument, and it makes wealth look a lot smaller because people are really good at saying what their wealth is. I mean, look at Donald Trump. God knows how wealthy he is. Probably not as much as we think, because it's really easy to exaggerate your wealth or make it look smaller. So he says, he's Polish, so I guess this is something like what Lessa said, is that you can break a thermometer, but it doesn't mean you don't have a fever. And he says wealth taxes make wealth look a lot smaller, so it looks like you have less inequality, but you still have it.
Okay. Gabriela, you obviously viscerally disagree with that.
Not viscerally, but I agree. I think I agree with innovation. Innovation, I mean...
Exactly, we did, didn't we? We definitely saw your body language.
I think innovation is important, as you say, and should be rewarded, but I think innovation should apply to the tax systems as well, because you're saying innovation is fantastic, should be rewarded, and why then not apply it to the tax system? I know it's hard.
I've got a lot of ideas.
Saying,
There's a lot of better ways to do it.
Earlier, sorry. So I think, you know, tax systems have stayed in the mid-20th century. They haven't even caught up with what was happening years ago. So there is huge opportunity. And in fact, you know, there are lots of European countries. There's Spain, there's Norway. There were very high tax rates in the US for several years of big economic prosperity after the Second World War. So when you say 1% or 1.5, like it is in Colombia, for wealth taxation, you're actually much lower than the rate of accumulation of capital by far. So people will still be getting richer, and it's not about that. It's about having funding for state programs for all. So we all benefit from health, and it's not a commodified element. If you have money, you live, or your health needs are addressed, and if you don't, you don't. What sort of society are we talking about? So when we say about reversing the tide of inequality, it's about having a society where you can expect certain things are cared for by the majority, and those who have more. And actually, I have here this letter from patriotic millionaires. So there's lots of millionaires in the US, in Europe, saying tax us, because it's the right thing to do.
Okay, I want to go to Joaquin in a second, but you have a wealth tax. You know the reality of enforcing it or how much you get. Can I just ask two questions? One is, how successful is it? And I'm sure you'll say very, but I'd love to hear why. And secondly, to what extent in a global world do people leave and just find a way to avoid it? So
let me point out that the wealth, I mean, the argument also was even worse for capital income. I mean, that's actually, historically it's interesting. Colombia created the wealth tax in 1936. So we have had a wealth tax for almost a century. And the basic reason why it was introduced, it was because the government at the time argued that because capital income is significantly underestimated, so the income tax does not capture all that should be captured for capital income. So the wealth tax was a complement to taxation of capital income. That was the basic historical justification. We actually had that tax for until 1990, so a long time, and then it has been introduced temporarily, and now we hopefully is a permanent. The wealth tax is by far the most progressive tax, and it's more difficult to evade the wealth than to evade capital income. That's why there's a basic reason to why the wealth tax is a good complement of the income tax. And the income tax, including the exceptions that are done, for example, in the US and most countries, the capital gains, which is a basic source of wealth, are totally untaxed or very tax.
And have a lot of people left the country to avoid that?
No. Actually, also, you could have, like in the U.S. has, in Colombia, we also have that. Any resident has to.
You have the same. Apologies for
yeah, it's universal. Right. You have to tax, and actually,
presumably that's kind of a prerequisite for having a successful wealth tax.
Yeah, actually, there is a way by which you have not reported your international taxes and your income and wealth. You have to do it, and it's a system that has actually been quite successful in having people tax exactly or reported income and tax, which is right. What is not correct, let me say, is taxing wealth on firms. It has to be on individuals.
Okay, Joaquin, what's your perspective on wealth taxes? Good idea, bad idea?
Well, I think the United States should have a serious conversation about it. Wealth inequality in the United States is greater than it's ever been. And as you all noted, it accelerated during the pandemic. I mean, it got worse. The rich got richer and the poor got poorer, or at least, at best, stayed where they were. So yeah, I think in that situation, you've got to take a look at something like that. The politics are certainly tough. There's no doubt about that. But that's also not a static environment. That's very powerful lobbying forces going in front of members of Congress and making their case with money and so forth. I mean, look, I just fundamentally don't believe that it's healthy when you have a lot of people who are playing golf all day, who are paying less in taxes than folks that are working 12 hours a day. Okay, I live in a district where people literally wake up early in the morning, leave their families at 7 in the morning, take public transportation, and then get back on public transportation after dark. Okay, and they're barely scraping by. And one way that you can tell it's unfair is whenever we talk, in the United States, there's not been a federal increase in the minimum wage since 2009. Whenever you hear people talk about less wealthy people or low-income folks working and the wages are being paid, folks will often say, well, it's the market. The free market will determine what wage we pay folks. Nobody ever talks about the free market determining what you're paying the top CEOs. for the Fortune 100 companies, right? So you're going to tell me that some guy that's making $100 million a year wouldn't work for $50 million a year? No, I mean, there's an excess there.
So are you in favor or not in favor of wealth tax, personally?
I'm sorry?
Are you personally in favor or not in favor?
Well, listen, I'd have to look at the proposal, but, you know, I think it's a conversation.
Intuitively, you think it's a good idea?
I think that it's something that should be looked at in the Congress, just like I think that our progressive taxation is something that we need to reaffirm. Republicans, as you know, cut corporate taxes and individual taxes. And so that has helped create a situation in the United States where wealth inequality has grown.
So I'm going to go to questions. Are there any questions in the audience? There must be some questions on this topic. You two. We'll start here and then go to the lady in the middle. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Emma. I'm with the Global Shapers community. Thank you all for gathering for this very important discussion. My question is that we know that inequality is really driven by systemic social determinants. So what can be done to really get to the root of these drivers rather than just addressing the symptoms?
Could you say who that's for?
Whoever.
Who would like to take that?
So I think maybe
Please.
We've talked about the tax element, but I think I've mentioned the point is investing that tax in social policies. So in fact, this tax is feminist and it's anti-racist and in fact decolonial if you look at how some of the colonial structures have been replicated in many ways. So it is, you know, redistributing in that when you capture or you raise the tax, levy the tax, but then how you invest it is critical, and that's when the social contract is important. And one of the key arguments that people sometimes give is, you know, corruption, and you don't know whether it's actually going to come into public services or anything. Higher inequality also breeds corruption. So the more one can invest on systems, on controls, on ensuring there's transparency and there's a way to monitor, then the more there will be a transformative social policies.
Joaquin, do you want to add to that? I mean, you raised the question early on around the roads that allow people to progress. I mean, do you want to just, because obviously one of the big questions is exactly that we didn't have time to get to, how do you spend this money? So,
yeah, I mean, I think in terms of social determinants, I mean, look, and part of the reason that you've got to invest in nations and invest in people is because the more poverty you have, the more likely people are going to be subject to oppression and violence and a weak rule of law and all of these things. And so the wealthier a place is, generally, not always, but generally, those things are going to be better and the indicators are going to be better, right? So, and I'm not saying that it's only a one-way causal relationship, like if you have money, all those things go away. But it certainly makes it less likely that people will suffer from those things and more likely that you will exist in a place that has an infrastructure of opportunity like I described.
the lady in the middle, thank you.
Hi, Saskia Broyston from UNO Social Business. Hi, Gabriela. I'm a big fan of your inequality report. And one of the things we've been talking about is CO2, carbon emissions. And that has been really the one single currency that has actually got companies to focus on the environmental side. So my question is, on the S in ESG, is inequality the metric that we should all get behind as businesses to change the social problems that we have? And secondly, what would be, in your eyes, the perfect level of inequality? Because my issue is always like, well, inequality is there, but I'm coming from a country, Germany, where, you know, we, at least in Eastern Germany, tried to look for a very equal society, which was also an issue. So what's the perfect level of inequality that we should live with?
Let's take that second part, because we don't have very long, but I think that if different people have views on that, yeah.
I think there's no perfect level of inequality, or I mean, it's thing what we want is that everybody has enough living standards to live a healthy, prosperous life and to live their potential. And what that means, I mean, there will be, you know, some people who have more for some reason or another. Some people may choose not to have. I mean, we don't necessarily all want to be billionaires at all, but we all want to have lives with purpose. I think that's the main thing. And carbon taxes, I think maybe, and you have the example in Colombia.
Yeah, let me perhaps point out that, you know, I mean, the climate change is probably the number one exception, you know, case of international inequalities and domestic inequalities. I mean, it's quite clear that the level of emissions per population that accumulated through history is highly unequal in the world, very highly unequal, and the developed countries are mainly responsible for that, and they are not meeting the goals or trying to support with enough resources the developing countries. That's one point. But domestically, it's the same problem. I mean, when you see the data on any country of who is responsible for the emissions, is the rich people. I mean, the poor people actually in many countries not only their emissions are very low, but they're also the victims, the main victims of the problem. Let's say, for example, small rural producers in my country, they are some of the victims of the floods generated by climate change. So that's one. So that's why the climate change is one of the best justifications for a strong action to reduce inequality.
So just a final thought from either of you on the right level of inequality. If the agreement is that there will be some, I mean, where do you kind of aim for, and is that a useful?
I agree with Gabriela. I think it's exactly. I mean, we have different ways of getting there, but I think as long as we have equality of opportunity, that everyone can reach their potential and live a dignified life.
Joaquin, final thought?
I agree. I don't think you can set a perfect level. I do think that there should be standards. We've argued for standard corporate tax rates, a floor at least, so that capital doesn't just move to the cheapest place, right? But you're not guaranteeing a perfect outcome where everybody's going to be the same. But you do want that infrastructure of opportunity everywhere.
Great. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you for coming.
Thank you.
Great conversation.